In 1971, a demolition crew was tearing through the wreckage of a collapsed stone building in Yancey County, North Carolina, when they broke open a wall cavity on the second floor and found a ledger sealed inside. The building had once been the Whispering Ridge Sanitarium, a place that closed its doors in 1902 and sat untouched for nearly 70 years. When they opened that book, they realized it wasn't a patient registry or a list of medical bills. It was written in a physician's hand, and it documented experiments conducted on children who had no family and no one to come looking for them. What happened to those children inside that building remains a dark stain on the mountains, and you have to wonder why someone felt the need to seal the record inside a wall. Yancey County sits deep in the Black Mountains of western North Carolina, which is the highest range you will find east of the Mississippi. The peaks here run above 6,000 feet, and the valleys between them are narrow and cold, and were almost entirely cut off from the rest of the state in the 1880s. Roads into the county turned to thick mud every winter, and stayed that way well into the spring. While Asheville looked close enough on a map, it was genuinely difficult to reach in practice, and that isolation was a condition people chose to exploit. The Whispering Ridge Sanitarium opened in the spring of 1887, with funding from a private medical society based in Raleigh. This was a group with no public charter, and no obligation to answer to the state, so they positioned the facility as a rest cure center. That was the kind of language the medical establishment used back then to describe a diagnosis that could mean almost anything, from grief and epilepsy to behavior a family simply found inconvenient. These facilities were fashionable at the time, and because the patients were understood to require total seclusion, a remote mountain county seemed like a reasonable location. The building itself consisted of 3 stories of heavy, dark, local stone, with a covered porch that faced the ridge to the west. Period correspondence describes a separate outbuilding on the property that was smaller and had no windows, and the letters only ever refer to it as the study ward. That is the only name it gets in any document that survived the century. The director of the sanitarium was a man named Dr. Aldous Crane, a physician who had trained at the University of Pennsylvania and published papers on what he called moral imbecility in children. This was a term the era used loosely to describe any child whose behavior did not conform to social patterns. And Crane arrived in Yancey County a full year before the sanitarium even opened. He was there when the first stones were laid, which tells you how deliberate the entire operation was from the very beginning. Yancey County had no formal orphanage during this period, so children without guardians moved through the mountains on informal arrangements managed by churches or county clerks. There was almost no paper trail attached to these kids, and because no one was assigned to follow up, a child could move from one house to another with very little recorded about where they went. The sanitarium accepted its first paying patients in 1887, but within 18 months, a second population appeared in the internal records. The ledger does not call them patients, but refers to them as research subjects, and not one of them was given a name. The youngest was 4 years old. The ledger spans 214 pages, bound in calfskin, and showing heavy water damage along the bottom third of the covers. While the spine is cracked, the binding has managed to hold together through the decades. 2 distinct people wrote in this book. The primary hand belongs to Crane, and his writing is a tight, precise copperplate that looks like it took a great deal of deliberate effort to produce. It is the handwriting of a man who wanted his records to be perfectly legible and permanent, as if he were writing for a future audience. The second hand is much shakier and less controlled, appearing only in the margins of the pages. When researchers examined the document in 1978, they attributed these notes to an assistant, likely someone who worked at the sanitarium, but left no name in any official record associated with the building. We will come back to that second voice later. Crane opens the ledger by laying out a clear statement of purpose for his work. He writes that certain psychological conditions are cultivated by the environment and can be extinguished through systematic stimulus and deprivation. You should read that sentence slowly and let it sink in. He is not describing a punishment, nor is he describing treatment in any recognizable therapeutic sense that we would understand today. He is describing a process for removing a piece of a child's psychology, the way a doctor would remove a splinter by locating it, applying the correct force and extracting it. The truly disturbing thing about this language is that it sits right at the edge of mainstream institutional psychiatry in the 1890s. The medical world was moving away from the idea that mental suffering required compassion, and instead, doctors began to view the mind as a mechanism that could be adjusted. Crane was not inventing a brand new philosophy, but he was applying an existing one without any of the oversight that might have slowed him down. The experiment categories Crane records in these pages fall into 4 specific types. First are the sleep deprivation protocols, which usually ran anywhere from 4 to 9 days at a time. Then there was isolation in the windowless outbuilding he called the study ward, where he tracked the duration in day increments. He also held sessions he labeled fear conditioning, and he described these in the same flat, clinical tone you would use to write a simple recipe. His language gives no more weight to what was being done to these children than a notation of a temperature or a physical measurement. Finally, he used dietary restriction as a tool for behavioral compliance, which meant food was withheld until a child produced the behavior Crane wanted to see. 31 children passed through this process over the course of 7 years. They ranged in age from 4 to 14, and every single one of them came through the county placement system. This was the same informal network of church referrals and clerk arrangements that had no legal requirement to track what happened to the children once they were moved. No parental consent appears anywhere in the ledger, because there were no parents involved in these cases. There was no one to consent on their behalf, and Crane never bothered to seek permission from anyone else. 2 specific entries from the ledger have been quoted in the limited academic writing that exists on this case. Subject 7 is listed as a 6-year-old who showed resistance to the isolation protocol, but the note says his crying ceased on day 4. Subject 14 was a 9-year-old who demonstrated what Crane called desired compliance following a 12-day dietary restriction. And the ledger notes he no longer initiates speech without prompting. When you read those entries, you have to sit with what they are actually describing in the real world. A 6-year-old stopped crying after 4 days alone in the dark, and a 9-year-old stopped speaking unless he was spoken to after nearly 2 weeks without enough food. Crane recorded both of these outcomes with the same steady tone and the same careful hand. There is no hesitation visible in the ink, and there are no crossed-out words on the page. Then there is that second hand in the margins. Forensic analysis confirmed in 1978 that these marginal notes were written with a different ink formulation than the main entries, which means they were not added during the original sessions. Someone came back to this ledger after the fact and read through what Crane had done, and the only things they left behind were single words written beside specific entries. Wrong. Please. God. These 3 words appear in scattered places throughout the document, and they are always placed next to entries describing the final outcomes of the experiments. They are not explanations or accusations, but simply those 3 words pressed into the margin by a hand that was clearly shaking. Researchers have never been able to identify who wrote those words. The ledger continues through Crane's work across 7 years of entries, and then the record just stops. The final entry is dated October of 1901. The sentence it ends on is unfinished and cut off right in the middle of a clause, as if Crane set down his pen and simply never picked it up again. 4 months later, the sanitarium closed its doors for good. Whatever he intended to write next, he never got the chance to put it on paper. The sanitarium officially closed in February of 1902. The paperwork submitted to the Raleigh Medical Society cited financial insolvency as the reason, which was a clean, bureaucratic explanation that required no follow-up and generated no further inquiry. The closing documents listed the assets and the debts of the facility, but they said absolutely nothing else. There was no mention of the research, no mention of the children, and no mention of the 7 years of work Crane had recorded in his ledger. Whatever had been happening inside those stone walls, the official record of its closure reads like the shutdown of a small hotel that simply ran out of money. Crane himself left the area a full month before the official closing date. By January of 1902, he was gone from Yancey County, and he only surfaces one more time in any professional record. He appears in a brief listing in a Richmond, Virginia directory in 1903, but there is no affiliation or practice listed next to his name. He is just a name and a boarding house address. After that, he disappears entirely. No medical licenses were renewed in any state, and he never published another word of his work. No death certificate has ever been located in any state before 1920, which means he either died somewhere, his death went unrecorded, or he kept moving and stopped using his name professionally. Neither of those possibilities has ever been resolved, and it seems Crane walked out of the mountains and out of the historical record at almost the exact same time. Then we have to look at what happened to the children. The ledger goes silent in October of 1901. Crane leaves in January, and the sanitarium closes in February. The county placement logs were supposed to track the movement of children in the informal system, but there is a gap in the records during this exact window of time. Children who appear in the placement records up to the point of their assignment to the sanitarium simply do not appear in the follow-up entries that clerks were supposed to complete. There are no discharge notations, no transfers to other households, and no deaths recorded with the county. In the county's own paperwork, the children who went to the sanitarium went nowhere afterward. They simply stopped generating any kind of record. That absence of information is not proof of the worst-case scenario on its own. Records in rural counties during this period were often kept inconsistently, and it was common for clerks to turn over or for forms to go unfiled. However, the gap is consistent enough and concentrated enough around the sanitarium specifically that researchers in the late 1970s flagged it as something meaningful. Routine gaps in history are usually scattered all over the place, but this one clusters around a single building and a single man. What the local memory preserved is a very different kind of documentation. Oral history interviews conducted throughout Yancey County in the 1970s turned up accounts from elderly residents whose families had lived there during the sanitarium years. These accounts were not detailed, but 3 separate transcripts from 3 different interviews contain the exact same phrase when the sanitarium came up. They all said, "That is not a place you ask about." They did not say they didn't know much about it, or that it closed before their time. That specific way of speaking implies that someone, at some point, told them very clearly not to ask questions. The building stood empty for decades after 1902. During World War II, it was used briefly for equipment storage by a county road crew, but no one ever repaired or maintained the structure. The roof finally gave way sometime in the 1950s. By 1971, when the demolition crew arrived to tear it down, the upper floor had partially collapsed inward, and the stone walls were the only things still standing. The ledger was found in what had once been Crane's private office on the 2nd floor. It was hidden in a cavity behind a layer of plaster, which was not part of the original stone construction, but had been applied over the stone at some later point. Structural analysis of the site indicated that this section of the wall had been finished after the rest of the office, likely very close to the date the building closed. Someone mixed that plaster and sealed the wall while the sanitarium was already in the process of shutting down. Crane did not do it because he was already gone. Someone else stayed behind long enough to put that ledger inside the wall, and we still do not know if they were trying to bury the truth or save it. To understand what Crane was doing, you have to understand what psychiatry looked like in the 1890s, because the context doesn't excuse him. It explains how he got away with it for as long as he did. For most of the 19th century, the dominant approach to mental illness in American institutions was something called moral treatment. The idea was that a disordered mind could be steadied through routine, clean surroundings, meaningful work, and humane care. It wasn't always practiced the way it was theorized, but the philosophy, at least, pointed toward compassion as a method. By the 1880s and 1890s, that school was losing ground. A harder, more mechanistic framework was moving in behind it, one that borrowed the language of physical science, talked about the nervous system as a correctable apparatus, and treated the clinician's role as closer to an engineer's than a caretaker's. The mind wasn't suffering, it was malfunctioning. You didn't comfort a malfunction, you corrected it. Crane's statement of purpose sits squarely in that second tradition, but he was also ahead of where mainstream institutions had actually arrived. The framework he described, stimulus, deprivation, conditioned behavioral outcome, predates John Watson's formal behaviorism by roughly 15 years. Pavlov's work on conditioned reflexes wasn't widely circulating in American medical literature until the early 1900s. Crane wasn't reading Pavlov and applying it. He was working toward the same conclusions from a different direction, in a windowless outbuilding in a mountain county, on children no one was tracking. What he was trying to produce, based on the ledger's outcome notations, was a state he named tractable quietude. That phrase appears several times across the document. He never defines it in a single, clean sentence, but the definitions accumulate through the entries. Tractable quietude, in practice, meant a child who didn't resist handling, who didn't initiate contact, who didn't ask questions or make requests, or cry in response to discomfort, who was, in the most precise and terrible sense of the word, manageable. Crane wasn't trying to heal these children. He was trying to produce a particular kind of person, and he was using deprivation as the primary tool. The dietary restriction component is worth slowing down on, because this is where the modern research fills in what Crane was observing without fully understanding. Prolonged malnutrition in developing children disrupts the formation of memory, flattens emotional response, and degrades the capacity for sustained attention. These are measurable, documented effects with a well-established physiological basis. Crane had none of that framework available to him, but his outcome notations, no longer initiates, reduced resistance, compliant without prompting, describe the symptoms of that disruption with a precision that suggests he was watching for it, recognizing it when it appeared, and reading it as success. The isolation protocols follow the same pattern. 4 to 9 days of complete sensory isolation in a young child produces dissociative symptoms, a kind of psychological retreat from an intolerable environment that can persist long after the isolation ends. The child doesn't recover full coherence when the door opens. Something reconfigures. Crane's notes don't use clinical language for this, because that language didn't exist yet. But when he writes, "Crying ceased on day 4," about a 6-year-old, he's describing a child who stopped expecting rescue, not a child who adjusted. Those are different things, and Crane either didn't know that or didn't care. The choice of subjects without family was never addressed directly in the ledger. Crane didn't write a justification for it. He didn't need to. The logic was structural, and he knew it. A child returned to the county placement system after weeks in the study ward, visibly changed, was a child who would be reassigned to another household and observed by no one with the standing to ask Crane what he'd done. A child who didn't come back at all generated no formal inquiry because there was no one formally inquiring. The system he was exploiting wasn't designed to notice what he was doing to those children. It was designed, however accidentally, to look the other way. The ledger records 31 subjects. That number is fixed. 31 entries, 31 assigned numbers, 7 years of documented procedures. When researchers in the late 1970s set that figure against the county placement records and tried to trace each child forward through subsequent documents, they could account for 19. 19 children appear somewhere after 1902, in a census entry, a church membership roll, a marriage record, a death certificate from a later decade. The other 12 don't appear anywhere, not in Yancey County records, not in adjacent county records, not in the state's institutional transfer logs, which tracked children moved between facilities, not in any church burial registry that researchers were able to locate and cross-reference. 12 children entered the county placement system, were assigned to the sanitarium, and after that assignment, generated no further document of any kind. To be precise about what that means, it doesn't mean 12 children died at Whispering Ridge. It means 12 children cannot be placed anywhere after 1902 using the records that survive. A death unrecorded, a child moved under a different name, a transfer that existed on paper that no longer exists. Any of those could account for some of the gap. Researchers working this case have been careful to say that, but careful acknowledgement of uncertainty doesn't make 12 missing children into 12 children who simply slipped through administrative cracks. The absence is the fact, and the fact sits there. The Raleigh Medical Society that funded the sanitarium was dissolved in 1908, 6 years after the closing. When it dissolved, its files transferred to a private law firm handling the estate of the society's founding member, a man whose name appears on the original funding correspondence, but nowhere else in the documented history of the sanitarium. That law firm's office caught fire in 1923. The files were reportedly destroyed. No insurance claim was filed for the loss. A law firm that loses its records in a fire and doesn't file an insurance claim is either negligent or had a reason to prefer that the records were gone, and those are the only two options. The second voice in the ledger margins, the shaky hand, the single words, was analyzed as part of the 1978 forensic examination. The confirmation that those notes were added after the main entries, using a different ink formulation, rules out the possibility that they were immediate reactions. Someone read back through this ledger at a later point, knowing what they were reading, and left those 3 words in the margins. Wrong. Please. God. Words a person writes when they have no other recourse and no audience except the document itself. A 1974 oral history interview adds one more thread. The woman being interviewed, then in her late 80s, relayed something her mother had told her, that a woman who worked at the sanitarium, a nurse, left in the middle of a winter night sometime near the end of the building's operation, walked off the mountain, carrying something. She wasn't seen in the county again. The interview transcript doesn't specify which winter, doesn't name the nurse, and the woman's mother had been dead for decades by the time the account was recorded. It's a second-hand memory filtered through 50 years, but it's consistent with the physical evidence from the wall cavity, that someone who wasn't Crane sealed that ledger behind plaster near the end of the sanitarium's life, and that person then left. The question the evidence keeps circling without answering is the one about intention. The ledger was hidden, but hidden can mean 2 completely different things depending on who did it and why. If someone sealed it in that wall to destroy it, they chose the wrong method. Plaster over stone in an abandoned building isn't destruction, it's concealment with a time limit. If someone sealed it in that wall to preserve it, they chose a method that kept it intact for 70 years in a building with a collapsed roof. Both readings are possible. Both can't be true simultaneously. Whatever the intention was, the ledger survived. The 12 children didn't leave a document behind. The demolition crew that arrived at the Whispering Ridge site in 1971 wasn't there to conduct an archaeological dig. Their job was much simpler. Clear a collapsed structure from private land, haul away the heavy timber, and move the stone. When they broke through a wall cavity on the 2nd floor, and a heavy ledger tumbled out, the foreman, a man named Roy Hensley, didn't toss it into the truck with the rest of the debris. He took it home instead. He later admitted that he could tell the book was old, and he figured it looked like something a museum or a library might actually want to keep. He placed it on a shelf in his house and simply left it there. That single decision was practical and entirely unheroic, made by a working man who had no real idea what he was holding. But it is the only reason this document exists in any archive today. In 1972, Hensley reached out to the Yancey County Historical Society to explain what he'd found and where it came from, even offering to bring the book in for them to see. The Society's response is preserved in their own meeting minutes from that year, which state that the matter was tabled pending further review. In the world of institutional language, that phrase usually means a discussion is being pushed to a later date. But in this specific case, the later meeting never happened. Or at least, it never produced another entry in the records. The ledger never appears in the Society's minutes again. No review was ever recorded, and no final decision was ever made. The matter stayed tabled indefinitely, and Roy Hensley eventually walked back home with the ledger still tucked under his arm. The book sat in his house for 5 more years. Hensley finally brought the ledger to Appalachian State University in Boone in 1977. He had heard about a professor there named Dr. Margaret Sorrells through a chain of local connections he never quite explained, and he knew she specialized in the history of the region. Sorrells was the first person with the professional training to read the document in full and truly grasp what she was looking at. She took custody of the pages and read through all 214 of them, later describing the experience during a 1979 oral history interview in a way that still haunts anyone who reads the transcript. She didn't claim to be shocked by the contents, but rather said the experience felt like a moment of recognition. Her words were that it felt like finding the explanation for something you already knew had happened, but simply couldn't prove. That is a very specific, heavy feeling, because it isn't the excitement of a new discovery or the sharp horror of something unprecedented. It is the settling sensation of a long-held suspicion finally taking a physical shape. Sorrells had spent years digging through Appalachian records from the late 19th century, so she knew exactly what those systems looked like from the inside, and she knew what they were capable of allowing. She spent the next year trying to get the contents of the ledger into print, but 2 different academic journals declined her submissions in 1977 and 1978. Neither publication offered a real explanation for the rejection. A third journal eventually accepted a summary paper in 1979, but they asked her to remove the specific details of the experiment protocols before they would publish it. Sorrells refused to cut those sections, so the paper was pulled entirely. The editorial letters from that journal have never been made public, leaving their motives a mystery. The ledger finally entered the North Carolina State Archives in 1981, after Sorrells arranged a donation with the Special Collections Division. It has remained there ever since, properly cataloged and available to any researcher who asks to see it. However, in the 20 years between 1981 and 2000, the document was cited in only 2 published academic works, and neither of those was read by anyone outside of a very small, specific subfield. 7 years passed between a demolition worker finding this record and a scholar finally reading it, and another 4 years went by before it reached the safety of an archive. Then it sat in that archive, perfectly findable, for 2 more decades, without ever generating the kind of attention you would expect for a record this detailed. None of this was the result of a grand conspiracy, and no single person was working to block the truth. The reality is that Hensley didn't know what to do with it. The Historical Society didn't want the hassle of dealing with it. The journals had their own internal reasons, and the archive simply filed it away where archives file things. The document that described exactly what happened to 31 children moved slowly through a system that felt no sense of urgency, mostly because systems are incapable of feeling anything at all. The part that really stays with you once you finish the full record is that Crane didn't actually build anything new. He didn't invent a brand new method, or start an institution from scratch, or create a system where none existed before. Instead, he found a system that was already functioning: the county placement network, the way medical societies were funded, the professional culture of 1890s psychiatry, and the simple geography of a mountain county where no one was looking. He used every bit of it. Every single piece of the machinery was already in place, and he was simply the one who understood what that machinery permitted him to do. The children who vanished after 1902 weren't erased by the cruelty of one man acting alone. They were erased by a set of social arrangements that never required anyone to account for them, because they had no families to report them missing, and no advocates with the power to demand any real answers. There was no record of grief that the state felt obligated to address. The system didn't fail these children. It worked exactly the way it was designed to work, and it was designed without them in mind. The ledger itself is a chilling object to examine, even if you set aside the actual text for a moment. It isn't a confession. Crane didn't write a single apology in those 214 pages, nor did he record a moment of doubt or admit that his treatment of those children was outside the lines of normal practice. It is a research record, kept with meticulous care and written for an audience that he assumed would share his worldview. The horror found in those pages isn't the work of a man who knew he was doing something wrong and did it anyway. It is the work of a man who genuinely believed he was doing science. And that is the part that never quite resolves, because it means the cruelty was built into the system long before it became personal. The only evidence in the entire record that anyone inside that building knew something was wrong is found in 2 witnesses: the shaky handwriting in the margins and the nurse who fled in the middle of the night. Neither of them was able to stop what was happening. Those marginal notes are just 3 words pressed into the paper by someone who had no power to change the situation. If the oral history is right, the nurse simply walked away and vanished into the world, carrying a burden we can only guess at. Witnessing an atrocity and having the power to stop it are 2 very different things. And the sanitarium was built to be isolated and unsupervised specifically so those 2 things would never meet. The 7 years between 1971 and 1978 don't prove that anyone was actively suppressing the ledger. What they prove is that there was no structure in place that forced anyone to treat the document as an emergency. A worker thought it looked old and took it home. A historical society put it on a shelf. A professor fought to publish it and failed. And an archive eventually filed it away. At every step, the people involved reacted according to the rules of the systems they lived in. And none of those systems had an alarm that went off to say, 31 children were hurt, 12 are still missing, and you need to act right now. The document waited because the world allowed it to wait. To this day, the children mentioned in the ledger still have no names. Every researcher who has touched this file has tried the same thing. They try to cross-reference the subject numbers against old placement records to find a name that matches the age and the date. It has never worked. The numbers stay numbers. Whatever names those children had when they were sent to the sanitarium didn't follow them into Crane's files. And the link between the 2 sets of records has never been found. They are still known only by the labels Crane gave them, which feels like the final insult in a very long list of them. The ledger is sitting in the North Carolina State Archives right now, and those 12 children are still missing. In the winter of 1902, someone tucked that ledger behind a stone wall and sealed it away with a layer of fresh plaster. The roof eventually collapsed, and 70 years of silence followed, until a demolition worker finally broke through the casing to pull the book back into the light. We have no way of knowing if the person who hid it was trying to protect the record or bury the evidence, and we likely never will. What matters is that the book survived, even though the children mentioned in its pages left almost nothing else behind. If you want to hear more stories that stayed buried because no system ever bothered to look for them, you should subscribe to the channel.